Okay, hello and welcome to episode 69 of the Follow Mechanical Turks project. So at this juncture, we've completed the second product, and we recently contacted the editor about bringing in invited reviewers.
Yep.
So he's working on that. We wanted to contact some folks who, primarily use some of the same sort of method approaches that were being used in the second product, which was taking a look at issuing surveys on MTurk and then looking at those for the kind of patterns that they provided. So we could see something about the ways that not only people or Turkers summarized different forms of content, but also how they responded to our solicitations for that. And then to some degree, what their positions were in terms of the task's fairness and clarity.
Yeah.
So at this juncture, that means, we're at the moment no longer revising that draft, so we're moving on to the next one. It's possible we'll get some more revision feedback on that second one at a later date. And it remains posted, so technically it's open for comments at any point.
Yeah, get up on there and I don't know, yell at us, congratulate us. Keep on adoration.
Yes. So the second product then is, for the moment, kind of in the books. So we were talking about transitioning into the third product. And the second product, of course, kind of, leads up to this, particularly in its conclusion, where it's discussing how the MTurk system, potentially theorizes what it means to be human, but also, what constitutes human production, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let me just share my screen here really briefly. Well, that's okay. It's legible. So, we can kind of see here in the brief conclusion, we point to this Stephen Johnson piece in the New York Times about AI in general, GPT-3, and this predates the kind of current wave of fascination with its cousin ChatGPT, although they're both from OpenAI. They're related systems. Curiously, also in a lot of ways, ChatGPT is a lot less robust than the GPT-3 or 3.5 or forthcoming 4 systems, in that they have it has a smaller number of features. It's a smaller corpus, essentially. Although it's more specifically trained, as I understand. I haven't, I don't know if there is open access to the actual algorithm, but its description suggests that it's more specifically trained to function as a chat bot, but has a less robust training corpus, although still, we're in the billions. Anywho, so it references Johnson's kind of position on these kind of text generators, and as the title suggests, mastering language. Should we trust what it says, right? And Johnson's position, potentially, kind of not necessarily a surprise, but a position that maybe casts things differently than our research was suggesting it. Right? It says, other critics believe that software like GPT-3 will forever remain compromised by the biases and propaganda and misinformation in the data it's been trained on, meaning that using it for anything more than parlor tricks will always be irresponsible. Kind of an interesting position, in that as our work is kind of predicated upon, it's possible that all forms of production, human or non-production, are also subject to those kind of biases. And, these terms are not themselves cut and dry and stabilized, right? These concepts. So what we are even calling, compromised or biased, or writing itself, is always at stake in the act. And therefore, Johnson seems to have a kind of, well, we know what writing is, we know what authenticity is, so therefore we kind of like can't trust these machines because they don't really know what they're saying.
Right.
And, our stance is, well, okay, but that position is complicated by the fact that we don't really have firm understandings of what those concepts are. And as humans, we're seemingly as subject, right? This comes up in the discussion of like stochastic parrots and bullshit. That it's like, well, you can't trust these machines because they're just fluent spouters of bullshit. And it's like, well, yeah, that's.
Yeah, be real careful there.
Yeah, it's like, possibly that's what you are, that's what we are. Keep in mind, like, those are human concepts. When you say it's like these things just spout bullshit, it's like, well, that's something you've made up. That's a concept it's based in human, right? It's like, it's sort of like how only humans are fallible, because fallibility is a human concept, right? In a sense, it's like rocks aren't fallible because they can only do what rocks do. Machines don't make mistakes, right? Because they can't, right? Error is a human concept. Another way to frame that would be, well, no, machines must do what they do because they are machines. It's possible the same thing is true of humans. We just sometimes intentionally ignore that because we want to see ourselves as special stuff, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Anywho.
The concept of that just reminded me, right? The machine only does what the machine does, right? It sort of reminds me of the discussions about glitch, right? That you open up a JPEG file and text edit, and text edit can't help but transduce it as text, right? That's just what it does. So it's not making a mistake. It's doing what it's supposed to do, which is rendering everything as editable text.
Right.
So it allows it to become something else, but it's not broke. You've not broken it. It's doing precisely what it's supposed to do.
Yeah. It's just how it interprets this thing.
Right.
But anyway, so we kind of conclude with this last gesture, right? Conclude by revisiting the question of rhetoric's particular contribution to this area of NLP research, the rhetorical situation, which is sort of largely our framework for the second product, that we can see these patterns that we noticed in the surveys in terms of meta discourse and other concepts as responsive to rhetorical situation, which gives us a hook into a larger rhetorical theoretical conversation. But as it implies here, it's like, that means we can bring that kind of historical analytical lineage to this conversation, right? It's like, so how can we participate in this? Well, the good news is we have this kind of framework that is relatable to this, or applicable, I should say.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the gist of what this leads into, in terms of starting our third piece. And we've talked about the third piece, even from the earlier days of parsing up the original project into, at that point, sort of three components, where it was like, well, the first one is kind of the text mining piece, where we're looking at an archive, right, a corpus of hit posts, and we're doing some different measures to see what they say, right? So we're looking at a corpus of their stuff, and this is the text mining piece. The second one was intended to be, this is where we're going to participate by making some hits and getting responses to some hits.
Yeah.
And so that one was always sort of based in that, the sort of survey aspects of, what are your thoughts about this, were something that grew out of that. But so we had the text mining piece, the, creating and getting responses to hits through surveys. Right? That was the second piece. This last one was always intended to be a kind of theoretical piece because, we're also in terms of focus, there are also different methods that go along with that. Like
Right.
Text mining, essentially surveys. Here, examining how systems like MTurk produce theory themselves.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we are with the third piece. So what are you kind of thinking in terms of its direction?
Oh, I mean, so much of it. I mean, one of my original thoughts, and we talked a little bit with Casey Boyle about this, was the sort of media theory approach of cultural techniques that sort of thinks about how media themselves generate concepts. So Bernard Siegert is one of the sort of chief, I don't know, proponents of cultural techniques. And he writes about all kinds of things, right? But he writes about like doors or fences or things like that, right? So that one has some sort of felt need, right? Like I need to keep this thing from eating this thing, and so it puts up a fence, and then that fence starts to then generate the distinction between, wild and domestic, or human and non-human. Mm-hmm. And then, right, what happens is we then retroactively read the generated concept as what caused the fence, right? That you need to put up a fence to keep out non-humans, right? But Siegert's point would be is that the fence itself is the theory that helps us to then parse the difference between human and non-human, or private and public, or inside and outside, right? These things are generated by media techniques themselves. So, right, the idea being is that from our original sort of sophistic non-Platonic approach to this, right, is we're not going to go into Mechanical Turks and seeing whether or not human intelligence task lives up or maps onto a notion of human intelligence and tasks that we already have, but essentially how is the way that it sets it up generating those concepts. So in that sense, that's kind of what we mean by Mechanical Turks is doing theory, which is it's sort of setting up an apparatus that allows us to observe and theorize and think about these terms.
Right.
But you're not thinking about them independent from the medium in which you're engaging them, right? So that whatever the human is, it's whatever distinctions set it apart. And we get to that part in the second half of the second piece, right? It's within the taskscape itself that the human and intelligence emerges again and again, right? Or the notion of readability, right? I mean, that's when we switch from readability, this is one draft, right? Then you started typing in like readabilities, right? So there's notions of multiple ones, and each of those are going to be grounded in a particular practice or taskscape. And so that notion of a cultural technique was sort of originally or early on where we thought that the third piece might employ that. And then that would allow us in part to link Mechanical Turks to see it as an instance of a particular cultural technique, but then we could link Mechanical Turks to, I forget the authors now, but the concept of heteromation, linking it to things like Uber and things like Fiverr, but also things like self-checkouts and ATMs, right? And anyways, like the original Mechanical Turk, right? These boxes in which humans and non-humans sort of swap properties and emerge differently in terms of what we understand the machinic or the human to be. And that emerges from these various cultural techniques. And that notion of seeing Mechanical Turks as a part of a cultural technique, right, then allows us to connect to other ongoing, phenomenon that might not necessarily be seen as related, but potentially we could, in the way that Professor Kang did, right, maybe see it as part of a trajectory or the kind of historical lineage, right? That the first Turkers was the first person to ever use an ATM,
Mm.
right? And then that follows from the mechanical Turk illusion, right? But there's this sort of, and how does that, and then that, right, brings in issues of labor, which is interesting. I mean, right, part of what's, I don't know, shifted our thinking is that we hadn't anticipated the way that the rhetorical situation would show up in that second piece. And that sort of emerged as a maybe a related or not mutually exclusive theoretical apparatus, right? If we have the rhetorical situation that we've already kind of fleshed out as a way of talking about the taskscape, which lets us talk about hits, do we now need cultural techniques? And then one of the reasons that maybe keeps cultural techniques relevant is all the new shit that's emerged in the last month or so. I mean, not new for our readers, right? And in part, right, the way that that's brought back up again issues of labor, right? I think the immediate response from sort of pedagogical circles was, oh my God, my students are going to turn in essays written by a chatbot.
Right.
But right, I'm thinking of Ryan Weber, right? The 10-minute TechCom episode that he just released, right? That there's like, the sort of tech writers now being replaced by GPT-3 because they can quickly generate memos or things like that. So there's, it's again brought back this sort of specter of labor, right? Like people being replaced for work. I wonder if Ryan might actually be a useful guest. He's not he could be. You could make him useful. But yeah, so that too is thinking about these new, in many ways, right? We're sort of, I think as you and I have talked about, right? We always feel like we're possibly timely, but also maybe like slightly behind because of the slowness. But it seems like there's a continued relevance for thinking about this. And again, it's brought back, right? I mean, we're having the same conversation that Johnson had at the end of last year.
Right.
Like we still can't talk about something like GPT-3 or GPT chat without recourse to these sort of static platonic categories. And they really, I think our argument has been, they seriously hamper our capacity to really think through these things.
Yeah. That's, yeah. And, I mean, research is always small c conservative, and that it's always, dealing with the past just because of its mechanisms are, intentionally slow and based in the consensus of peer review. So it's always in a sense, working with things that are less timely than, might something like journalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like a lot of, because like the thing we were discussing at the end there was about a similar program. I mean, it's by the same org. They're both by OpenAI. It's kind of interesting, in fact, to consider why did, Chat GPT hit in a way that the previous ones, even though in a sense, it's more limited in terms of parameters, right? I mean, it's a smaller thing. I mean, it seems like one of the reasons why it hit was it was just more broadly accessible, right?
Yeah.
GPT-3 still required a couple of hurdles in order to access it, right? I mean, it was a little more limited in terms of its, its public access. Yeah. Whereas, this other thing was more or less a chat bot. You can go to, right, online and start prompting it. It's interestingly been a little complicated. I'm sure you've run into this recently, that it's getting overwhelmed.
Yeah.
If you go there now, it gives you this, we're busy. Give us your email address and we'll contact you whenever it's up, which, at least in my experience so far, does not happen. They just simply throw that into the garbage, it would seem.
Yeah. No, it's really curtailed my fascination with getting Chat GPT to talk about farts. It's just too busy. It doesn't have time for that.
Well, I was going over it in class. And in fact, that showed me what I need to do is capture these and then leave them, because if you want to do a live demo in class, it inevitably will be down.
Yeah.
which itself is kind of an interesting thing. It's like it's only useful to the degree that it's available. But, one thing, a quirk of that is that even if it says we're busy, if you just keep refreshing, eventually it'll come up. It's like
Yeah, yeah.
you'll slip through. So
No, it's very much something that at all levels you have to keep negotiating with.
yeah, it's curiously responsive to bullying in certain ways. If you prompt it and it'll say, I can't really do that. If you just kind of ask it again, it's like, all right, and it'll do it.
Which is unsettling. I mean, there's a part of me when I got it I was like, yeah, I finally got it. I'm like, also, when I look back, I'm like, yikes. If you didn't know, like if someone just looked at the chat and didn't know that one of them was a chat bot and that they thought it was two people, it looked real bad for me.
Yeah.
I was like, well, I know you've got qualms about this, but what if we did this? And then it's like, okay, finally it relents and then does it.
There's a coercion that's, not too far from like other forms of interrogation where it's like, all right, I'm just going to keep asking the same question in different ways to see what gets me in here.
Yeah.
When in a lot of situations, it's like, well, just the process of the wearing down is what does it. But anyway, so yeah. And, for our purposes, it's maybe a difference of degree, but it's a meaningful one in that, it wasn't GPT-3 and its forebears that caused, academic consternation like this, right? I mean, now every day there's a new, NYT or some bullshit think piece about universities scrambling to figure out policy. And, like my own institution is going through those convolutions as well.
Yeah.
I, of course, volunteered. I was like, hey, I really need to be part of this as someone who studies it and teaches writing, because, from my understanding was university's initial response was like, well, let's just talk to CS people.
Yeah.
Only CS people have something to say about this. And it's like, are you sure? Because this is our entire pedagogical approach.
Yeah.
And again, so I sent a email saying, someone in our area really needs to be a part of this. And I got a nice, but seemingly inert. Okay, we'll keep you in mind. But since then, nothing. So
no, we're worried about our students turning in these essays that have been written by chatbots. You want to email the director of the writing program who does digital rhetoric? Is that somebody wanted? Now we're good.
Yeah, kind of interesting. I mean, I get it, but it's also like this is the problem.
Yeah, it's a computer. So computer people like there's no other. Yeah. So because what's funny is it's
only in terms of tech problems, right? And so the answer will simply be more of it, right? Well, then in addition to this, what we need is a surveillance system that's going to prevent it.
Yeah, which will have to be bought. Yeah, so it's like you could have talked to me and we could make this real cheap.
But anywho, but I digress. So yeah, I mean, thinking about the piece, then that was a question I had was, does the cultural techniques, which I'm not really familiar with, does it still have legs or import or utility, I suppose? I mean, is that something rhetorically that is often framed in terms of a broader conversation about situation?
Yeah.
Or not? Anywho. So kind of what I've been doing is, and this came up as we were writing, and because of our topic, I suppose there are frequently these sort of incidents, that do shape kind of the direction of things, which I don't think there's anything wrong with. I mean, previous to the emergence of ChatGPT, we were paying attention to the chess cheating scandal. That to boil it down, a sort of noted grandmaster, the bad boy of grandmaster chess.
That's so
Um,
sad.
what's that?
That's just the idea of someone imagining themselves as the bad boy of chess is just you
Well, and
understand,
I'm putting,
you leave this hotel ballroom and like you're gonna get a wedgie. You understand that, right, bad boy?
I'm putting that label on it, but he's young and sort of popular in a way that most, I think, chess personas are not.
Or not? Yeah.
There's a geez, I mean, there's an old thing in the animated show Dr. Katz, where this comes up, where I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the characters is describing to his therapist that he was at a concert, and he said one of the cellists is kind of like visibly into it and nodding his head, and he's like, "What are you, the bad boy of the cello section?" And that's always stuck with me. Like in academic fields where they're like, he's the controversial one. I'm like, you're the bad boy of the cello section. Who gives a shit?
Yeah. No, it's yeah. You're the toughest guy at this Four Seas ballroom.
Yeah. That comes up in Seinfeld too, where he's outside of an opera, right? Remember, and he's flipping a coin and the coin drops and someone says, "That's mine." And Seinfeld kind of bullies him out of it.
Yeah, that's right.
If you remember that, he's like, "You think I care about the money? I don't care about the money." And the guy backs down and he's like, "I like this opera crowd. I feel tough." This is always no. Well, I mean, that itself is a kind of cultural affectation, right? That these elevated pursuits are necessarily effete, right? Be they chess or opera, the idea is it's intellectual and therefore, the domain of only the
easily bullyable.
What?
The easily bullyable.
Sure. Anywho, so we were paying attention to that cheating scandal where, Carlsen was defeated by another young player, but an American and someone with a different kind of reputation. In fact, an admitted previous cheater who, had said yes, because a lot of chess has moved online,
right,
which is relevant. It's like the entire, I always quail at nature, but nature, but not objective nature of the game has changed, where it's like, as we're seeing in these other areas, it's like, well, yeah, chess bots are a thing and they're just part of the game. It's like, human players play against them, they train with them. A recent one just came out that, and I think I have this saved, uses the persona of a cat. In fact, do you play chess online?
No.
I
don't want to get catfished.
Well, in this case,
I didn't even realize I'm going to take credit for that pun.
Yeah, it's let me just pull this up. It's Mittens.
Of course.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is like this intentionally leans into, the internet is cats trope.
Yeah.
But it's this, explicit chat bot called Mittens, which is apparently quite good, still not able necessarily to routinely beat the best players, but quite good. But anywho, the cheating scandal itself was that this young teen is somehow getting input from the machine, because otherwise there'd be no way for this person to beat this other person, right? He has to be cheating, and that means it has to be mechanized. And for our purposes, it's a really interesting inversion of the original mechanical Turk, which was the small man inside the machine. And here we have the small machine inside the man, because the interesting leap that was made is, well, he doesn't appear to be getting signaled.
Yeah. It must be it's anal beads.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of curious, and I was tracking these stories to see, why would you jump to that, right? And without some kind of supporting circumstantial evidence that, oh, okay, well, it has to be a butt plug that's vibrating.
Yeah.
Let him know, I mean, even because it's like, that seems like a convoluted, it doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's like, there's as much evidence for that as, well, it's a hollow tooth, right? I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
they're
No,
both equally possible.
I think, right, that probably reveals more about whoever made the original accusation and potentially some hangups they have about sex. Right. It's another deviant, like the I would imagine they imagined like the butt plug that vibrates is somehow more evocative or deviant as a hollow tooth that vibrates. Or
Yeah, I mean,
the accusation itself was always meant in jest and designed to be the most outrageous thing that person could think of.
right. And yet, as we've seen repeatedly, through things potentially like QAnon, a joke is not a thing. It's not like a separate thing.
Right.
Like, well, I was kidding about
kidding. Right.
being in a butt plug. It's like, well, but it, everything functions as if true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting for that reasons that, and Dr. Kang pointed this out. I mean, the Turk was intentionally exotic, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, it's the mysteries of the far Orient, that have come to our little burg the same way, well, not the same way, but similarly to how something like Dracula, it's like, it's the mysteries of the shadowy East.
Right.
Which is fine until it comes to London, right? The Turk is fine as long as it's not in Europe. Here, there are manipulations of that in kind of an interesting way. That, I mean, the cheater, the purported cheater, was American, whereas Carlson is, what is his nationality? He's
Norwegian.
Yeah, he's Scandinavian, but I don't. Yeah, and chess has become a European and Asian game.
Yeah.
Europe and particularly through Russia, and also other Asian countries. It's become theirs. So the American teenager is this kind of like, he has to. There's no way an American is smart enough.
Yeah.
The American is exotic. It's like, well, if it's
a surly, non-serious American teenager, as opposed to a more staid, conservative, a more sort of seemingly serious chess player.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's like Carlson is insouciant, but not enough to be destabilizing. He's precocious, is what he is. Yeah. I mean, that's his persona. Even though, I mean, he's an adult. But because he's been, sort of a leader in chess now for several years, he still has, the way a child actor might, kind of this patina of being, the enfant terrible or something. But it's like, but it's all contained within, oh, tut. He's, the bad boy of chess versus a cheating American teenager who's the actual bad boy of chess.
Yeah.
Although it may not be. I mean, he's just being positioned as it. So it's like, yeah, he's sleazy, so he has to be sticking something up his ass, right? I mean, it's like,
and in that sense, right, the butt plug is the turban, right? It's the kind of equivalent. It's the equivalent sort of, yeah. I think that's
the turban and the brown skin. It's yeah. I mean, it's just, as an episode, it's informative, and for our purposes, it's it's a really nice button and segue, because it's just this clean inversion of the machine inside the man, right? I mean, it was the man inside the machine, but now it's the machine inside the man. And it also, it underscores who's given primacy, right? Yeah. The mechanical Turk, there's got to be a dude in there, because there's no way this wooden robot could be doing this here. It's like, there's got to be a microchip somewhere in that skin bag, because there's just no way this guy could do it,
Right. And somewhat relatedly, right, that the other, when when Kasparov was playing Deep Blue in like the late 90s, and he lost. And at one point he accused the IBM team of having a human inside of Deep Blue, basically. Like he really, like, not even an inversion, like he's actually making he's making the original mechanical Turk. Right. No, that was too intuitive a move. I can't believe a computer did that. You're cheating. You've got a person back there somewhere.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that we can see this sort of chronological shift, the convolutions of this shift. And now it's firmly on the side of there's got to be a machine in there. No human could play with this level of precision or.
Yeah. And I think and I don't know how this, I mean, right. I think there's a way, I mean, one of the reasons that I'm going to put a pin in where I was going and come back. And now I lost where I was coming back from. But right, oh shit, I really screwed myself there. Right. But there's this moment where like the linkage between the two things is too good of a place to not start this.
Yeah.
Right. Like this inversion. Right. And I'm wondering if there's a way, right? The idea of, I know where I was going. This also links it to rhetoric, right? That this constant, that what's ubiquitous across this, no matter the flip, is this anxiety and suspicion and paranoia about what's causing what, right? Like this need to, like, if intelligence doesn't have a direct source, then right. So there's this in the same way in which Plato was distrustful of rhetoric, right? Because there's no ideal form anchoring it. Right. It's not surprising that like bullshit gets used to describe GPT-3, right? Because it's not grounded in some absolute. So therefore it's bullshit. If we can't know that this kid, right? So there's sort of the way that suspicion and distrust, right, proceeds over the ethos of this game, right? That no matter where the inversion is, the one thing that's constant is somebody's worried about somebody tricking them somehow. Because there's no firm embedding of intelligence. Like, that's intelligence and it knows what it's doing and it knows what it's saying at all times. And if we don't have that, then how do we go forward?
Yeah.
Right. So there's this sort of interesting through line of that seems to be what's consistent, is that sort of platonic anxiety about authenticity or reality or something. And then my other thought that I think one of the things that maybe makes cultural techniques still have some purchase here is precisely that, like the notion of the machine inside the human, I think is a really interesting way to think about, right, concepts themselves, right? To a certain extent, you could make the argument that what cultural techniques is arguing is that the concepts that you have are embedded in a kind of machinic material reality, right? That when you think about the difference between a human and a non-human, that's a fence inside of you, right? That's a cultural technique. That's a media somewhere in the world through which you are generating this conceptual apparatus, right? So even the idea of the difference between a concept I have, the difference between inside and outside, is because I've got a machine inside of me, right? The window that's helping me to generate that concept, right? That difference between inside and outside is not me alone generating that concept, but it's generated because I'm somehow, I've got a machine inside of me.
Yeah.
Helping me to generate that concept in much the same way, right, that a hollow tooth might be helping this punk play chess, right? That idea that our concepts themselves are being generated through media, right?
Yeah. Does that tie to Kang's discussion of like the metaphor? Because is the concept that we're now framing it, thinking as, so for example, yesterday on Reddit, I saw someone who, to make this concrete, someone was carrying a sign that says God is pro-life, and an interviewer who was, he knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
Intentionally said to him, yeah, but didn't God kill everybody except a bunch of animals and two folks? And the person kind of, I think because he kind of knew what he was up to, kind of looked at him and sort of paused and then just kind of clicked back and said, well, God is pro-life. And this was described as soft reboot, right? And so the metaphor there of, well, thinking now is a machine. And I mean, it recalls how Kang was discussing like things like, the metaphor for life, how vegetable shifted from active to inert, right?
Yeah.
The framing of the human as during the industrial age, a machine, to now a calculator.
Yeah.
Does the metaphor do the labor of that definitional labor?
I think so, right? Because part of what Kang's argument was is that whatever our imagination about the human is it's always being shaped in relationship to technological developments. Like in that sense, a machine can do X and then we take what's left, right? Like the human is sort of the miscellaneous bin of ontology, right? Like whatever. So in that sense, right, our sense of self has always been driven by the machine, and our metaphors are simply, I think, reflective of that, right? But the metaphor is being driven by the emergence of particular media or particular technological capacities. So it's not as if we started with a definition of the human and then that definition was then violated. Right. The definition is almost always a kind of what's the sort of military term, right? It's always a sort of rear guard action. And so in that sense, right, that even our sense of selves is responsive to relationships with media and technology.
Yeah.
I mean, that's at least my reading of Kang is, right, like that at any given moment, the idea of what a human was always in a kind of agonistic relationship with the means of production or communication of a particular moment.
Yeah. Well, and in this conversation about like Chat GPT, I mean, something we and some other folks were kind of batting around, and this has certainly come up, right? I mean, this has come up in this discourse of, well, I mean, the calculator exists, and to an extent, I mean, it's a much more kind of established thing because computers are, in a very real way, calculators, right? I mean, it's like the core metaphor of a computer, right? The binary and what it was designed for was numerical calculation. Yeah. So there's a sense in which, despite the wondrous things that computers can do, in a sense, they're always kind of running home to mama that, it's a calculator. The way it can do this stuff is it's adding up sums in certain ways, which is fascinating because I've always been kind of intrigued with the possibility of, instead of the computer growing up, in a sense, kind of in the wake of World War II and the desire to do things like calculate complex trajectories, which then got folded into things like, our space program, right? Where it's like, well, hey, firing, this projectile isn't too different from what we're doing here. And then, that changed a little bit with rocket technology, but it's like, there's a serious through line. This is nothing novel that I'm saying, from war production into our space program, to the degree that, hey, Von Braun, you're with us now.
You seem good at this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I've always been kind of fascinated of what would happen if instead of the computer being a grown calculator, it being something predicated on language, right? Instead of the binary bit, what if its core thing was like an alphabet? And it's not like that's crazy because, it could have come through something like cryptography. What if the Enigma machine was our main thing, where it's like our core thing is working with language, trying to understand language?
Yeah.
What would computer tech be like if it's, was a language device rather than a calculator device? But anyway.
So that would be, well, it's related in the sense that, right, why is it that getting a computer to play chess has somehow been this, right? What if chess wasn't the sort of metaphor we trained, right? So in addition to it being trained on as a calculator, it was trained as a calculator in coordination with, right, war games, chess, right? It's got all these. So what if it got trained on, language games and
Yeah, I
Poker,
mean,
or I don't know, right? So, or you know, or it got trained on language and, you know, Dungeons and Dragons or something.
yeah, right. I mean, and you know, there we see the edges of this with something like the Turing test, where the idea is you fooled me. You know, it's like, and
Yeah,
that's based, you know, in its original form on language, right? Where it's like it's a translation,
yeah.
right?
Which is
Um,
really interesting. I mean, of course, the idea, as I was just saying, right, the idea of deception permeates this, right?
yeah,
The original test for determining whether or not a computer had reached human levels of intelligence was its capacity to trick you.
cool.
I mean,
Yeah,
the Turing test is, can it get you to believe? Of course, I actually find that, well, that probably is how it works. I consent to your yeah, it also reminds me, there's a great short story by Ted Chiang called the life cycle of software objects. And essentially the kind of argument, if you know, that the short story makes is that if you really want artificial intelligence, you'll have to raise it, not program it.
yeah,
It ignores the ways in which human beings, right? We tend to assume that human beings somehow are born with intelligence already programmed into us, and ignores the ways in which our intelligence emerges through caregiving and relations.
right.
Problem with artificial intelligence is no one's raising it; they're programming it, which is not how parenting works. So it's a really interesting, right? Similar, right? If you not trained it on as a calculator using Turks, and you thought of it as a parenting or pedagogical enterprise as opposed to a programming exercise.
Yeah, well, and that comes up. We touched upon in the second product in part. Let's see, it's near at the end here with animal intelligence, right? The
Yeah.
wondrous thing about the parrot is it had someone work with it for
Yeah.
decades. Like
Yeah.
here, this Chaser, the smartest dog in the world,
Yes.
learned from social inference. But what's interesting here is this person has been working with this dog for its entire life. And so, like, it has this kind of wondrous vocabulary, as it were. But it's like, yeah, it worked with an evolutionary anthropologist who was its owner for 10 years, right? 5 hours a
Yeah.
day, 5 days a week for 10 years, where it's like,
That
it's interesting as, you know, an icon of dog intelligence. It's like, yes, but, you know,
but I mean, in many ways, it goes back to that notion of, like, that's how intelligence is not a kind of inert property, right?
right.
It's emergent, right? So the notion of, I mean, I think the reminder there is like, that's, maybe the dog has different capacities, but intelligence is in large part a function of artifice.
Yes.
Sense
A
of artifice
construction.
as a structure, as a, right? It's, so the idea that artificial intelligence will somehow just become intelligent, independent of its upbringing, right, or its training is, but of course, I mean, which is interesting. I mean, at least Stephen Johnson gets there in that piece, right? He gets very close to the sort of Richard Lanham sort of Q question, right? The idea that if artificial intelligence is going to be a citizen, right, we have to start thinking about how it's trained, right?
Yeah.
Like that for me is, I think, is the much more interesting question. I don't actually care whether it's intelligent or not, because that's not something you can,
Yeah.
like,
That's that's philosophy's question is, you know,
yeah,
ontics.
I'm not
So
I'm
is
not
it
interested
or isn't it? And it's like, that's an empty question.
I'm not interested in is, like,
Right.
that's neat, good luck. But because by the way, I mean, right, part of our point we're getting at is, okay, let's say you could determine absolutely that it is intelligent. That would solve none of the problems we
Now what?
have. Like, that would,
It's
what
so
would
you
that
dust your hands and say, well, that's that then, you know.
Yeah, but that would fix precisely nothing. It would not actually solve any of the problems that we perceive with this. Well, it's really, we actually know it's intelligent now. Okay, neat, but should it drive cars? Well, it's intelligent. Yeah, that's not helping me, guy. Like, that doesn't actually help me make any decisions.
What it does is, um, it enables, I mean, in the way that that happens in the Platonic dialogues in places, it enables, once we've pinned something to a definition, it allows the unwinding of things, though, right? In the same
Right.
way that, like, if I now can say this river is, or the way Mitt Romney would say this corporation is a person,
Yeah.
or this, what we're doing with drugs is a war, right?
Yeah.
But that's,
Yeah.
that's kind of the point. Is it's like, yeah, but it's not like we've solved an essentialist mystery. It's like we've allowed certain actions to occur. That's
Yeah.
what it does.
Yeah.
Is it's like,
Yeah.
if it's framed as X, then Y is going to happen.
Right.
Something, and it's one of the things I pulled up there is a through line for all of our pieces is telling, right? This notion of the
Yeah.
tell. And the tell is wrapped up in deception.
Yeah.
And that piece that I pulled up, it's an Atlantic piece called Chess is Just Poker Now, which is, neat because it's also like kind of a snide pejorative.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah.
But what it's getting at is in part that, the tells that exist in those games are of a different sort, that the information, and I believe we explicitly state this in the second piece. It was there, whether or not it made it. That in chess, the information is seemingly, this isn't the case, but seemingly known, where it's like everyone sees the board. Right?
Yeah. There's none of the chess pieces are covered.
Right. You're not, as you are in poker, concealing information in the same way. What you're doing in chess with a tell is concealing intent, right? It's like feints. You thought I was doing this, but in fact, I'm doing that, right? So the tell is, seemingly an unintentional reveal of intent rather than information. And that's kind of interesting because it suggests also in poker that there's little wiggle room for intent, right? Where it's like, this is solved. If you have these cards, your behavior is programmed. The only question is, what cards do you have? Right? You can kind of see that in poker when people get pissed, as we saw again with a cheating scandal, this time involving a woman, where, underneath the criticism was, you don't really know how to play competitive poker player. It's like, when you have those cards, this is what you do. This is your behavior. This is your prescribed behavior.
Right.
And indeed, if you've ever gambled in Vegas, that happens. Is like, if you, in blackjack, if you hit when you're not supposed to hit, people get legitimately angry at you that you've stolen their card. And it's like, fuck you. The whole point is I have some degree of agency when to do this,
Yeah, you're not in fact playing chess right now. You are playing a game where you get handed cards. Yeah, it's always, I found me when I think sometimes when people who play poker a lot sometimes protest too much about how it's not about luck. I mean, I get that it's not. I'm willing to concede there are people who play better than others. But if you get dealt shit cards,
right,
you can't win unless you bluff someone off the table. But when those cards are down, that's because there's this article, I think it's in the New York Times Magazine called No Limit. But it basically says they're getting close to the point where poker is solved.
Right. Yes. That's the presumption. And, that's always kind of interesting because then, yes, it's like, well, then it is luck. Like then blackjack, then you shouldn't be allowed to indicate, do I hit or I stay? Everyone just sits at the table. The hand is dealt, but no one says anything because it's like, oh, well, on this you hit. So at that point, it's like, it's literally just a coin flip, win or lose. That's all this is. It's just chance. If the notion of, call it agency or whatever, or, deception or tells is removed.
Yeah. No, I always take a certain kind of joy, and I think particularly a certain kind of masculine poker player who loses, and because they shouldn't have, it's like, that's not, what are you talking about? They had it's
well, and
weird.
there may be some, I don't think too much, because I think it might derail. Well, we'll see. But yeah, I mean, those two things, poker and chess, are an interesting dichotomy in things like that. Like, well, poker is seen as this masculine thing in a way that chess is not, right? Chess is, as we touched upon before, effete and intellectual, in a way that poker is like, well, this is the game of the businessman, the bullshitter.
Yeah.
The big voice, right? You're a fighter if you play poker, whereas if it's chess, it's all brain, right? Whereas poker is all balls. And it's interesting. It's like these, in many ways, it's like from the outside, these are both the same stupid thing.
Yeah. You're just sitting there staring at somebody moving toys around the table. This all seems so silly to me.
But I mean, they're and in part because almost at the same time, in fact, they were connected in some of these articles, these journalistic articles.
Yeah.
They connected this previous chess scandal with this poker scandal. In that case, in fact, it's kind of interesting. They didn't accuse the woman of ramming something up her ass. In her case, they said, well, it must be a ring.
Yeah.
You must be wearing a vibrating ring. Oh, and by the way, this wouldn't be unusual because a similar charge was made in, recently in chess, leaving aside none of any of this was ever proved, right?
No.
Kind of the big mouth theory of truth. Is this real? Well, you're thinking about it and we're talking about it. Therefore, it's valid. Or as we see with, and I think this is a fair charge, current Republican political action, which is, well, we need to take steps to cure the problem of mistrust in elections, mistrust that we have wholly borne, right?
Right.
We need to take steps to alleviate the problems that we have caused.
Yeah.
Here, it's like we have manufactured a scandal based on completely spurious information, and that itself becomes the groundwork for future ones.
Yeah.
Anywho, so I mean, the paper itself, like right now, what I'm doing is we've got these notes on the chess issue, which is a really tidy way into this.
Yeah, it's too good.
The question then is, what's next? Because right now we're collecting a lot of stuff about like Chat GPT, and I think that's valid. But then it's like, well, is the third piece a reading of that? And I don't think we want it to be.
No, I mean, right there's a word even in the conclusion of the second piece, I think there was like, well, we don't want to talk too much, right? We kind of early on say like, we think this is analogous. So there's also a sense in which the more we talk about Chat GPT, right, that's not really this. Yeah, we don't want to lose focus on. I think that's why focusing on the chess and the poker scandals, I think that I think will at least help us stay grounded in the sort of mechanical Turks conversation, and then potentially and this maybe is another mark in favor of at least holding on to the use of cultural techniques is sorry. Is there a way that cultural techniques allows us to sort of adjacently deal with GPT-3 as a kind of, we're seeing this as a kin, right? Because it's being trained on the internet, right? That there's, I mean, because that's a whole other question of these sort of AI content producers, is what are they pulling from, right? I mean, this is, I'm thinking back to, again, the I can't think of the guy that Ryan Weber was interviewing, but Ryan sort of raised the question of copyright with respect to these GPT text generators. And the guy's answer was, right, we're using sort of predictive models. And so Chat GPT is not wholesale pulling passages from the internet and passing it off as its own. It's sort of doing predictive text kind of stuff, right? That if you type this, statistically, this comes next. So it's
purely probabilistic.
So it's not plagiarizing in the sense that it's pulling whole cloth passages from something else, but it's also, right, pulling from this large that, but it is pulling from text that people have written potentially, right? Or it's trained on them, right? So there's also that sort of, I don't know, labor issue, or again, right, the human machine merger that's still implicit somewhere there in something like GPT-3. Right. It's not, in other words, right, is it's being passed off as artificial intelligence, but is it at a certain sense still the kind of artificial intelligence, right? In the sense, right, when I asked GPT, when Chat GPT, right, write me an email that apologizes to Jeremy for burning his house down with my flatulence, it didn't want to do it. Nice, right? Because there's guardrails have been put on it that prevents it from, so even then, right, I'm thinking of that heteromation where there's probably still human content moderators or things like that. So yeah.
Well, see, and this is, I think that gives us entry to these other. So right now, one of the things I'm doing is collecting all these links about these related, and it's not a coincidence that a lot of these things all broke at the same time, right? At the same time when we were dealing with Mid-Journey and Stable Diffusion, Chat GPT kind of emerged, because they're all kind of predicated on similar technologies where it trains on a gigantic corpus and then can probabilistically generate stuff that as you say, it's like it, but it's not really like pulling whole chunks. Right. Curiously, for my purposes, because we look at ChatGPT in class, and we're starting to have conversations with my students about, because I don't forbid them from using it, but I'm like, given the parameters of our assignment, here are ways that are advantageous and less advantageous. And one of the big things right now, although this feels like something fixable, but it is interesting, is ChatGPT-3 is pretty bad at sourcing. It gives you a lot of good information, but it's like, yeah, but where is that coming from? And it doesn't do a good job of like, a literary analysis paper where it's, it discusses themes in Jane Eyre, and it's like, oh, and you can see it in this quotation. It's not great at that, in part because, I think because it is probabilistically generated, it's like the intent is not to pull things out wholesale, right? Go find a quotation that proves what it is you're saying here. Yeah. To me, right now, it's not good at that. And to me, it's like, that seems like it should be an easier problem to solve, but maybe it's not because of the way it functions. But, anyway, this stuff right now, because right now there are lawsuits, and I haven't listened to that interview, but right now there are lawsuits by artists against, I believe it's both Mid-Journey and, Stability AI, Mid-Journey, DeviantArt does DeviantArt have their own? Because normally that's a website where you can just post it. Well, whatever.
Yeah.
It's interesting because this will get hashed out legally, and it will have something to say about the personhood of AI, right? Where it's like, because as that CEO was potentially saying, well, it's not just copying what people have done. Imagine it more like an art student who has seen the works of Van Gogh and seen art on the internet and is now generating its own art. It's like, that's what humans do. That's what's going on here. But at the same time, these people are saying, well, no, it's using my copyrighted creative work as training fodder. And potentially that might mean something like it's a derivative work, right? It's like, well, no, it's seen this. It's a machine mechanistically transforming it, but it's still derivative. There's a little bit of me in there, and it'll be interesting to see how this goes, because it's possible, if maybe unlikely, that it's the way it ends up is it's like, okay, well, companies who do this, you're going to have to start paying royalties to every copyright holder in your training set, right? Where it's like, it'd be, fractional, but it'd be like, okay, well, we trained on your art, therefore every time it's used, you get a fraction of a penny or whatever.
Yeah, like a sort of Spotify
Yes.
model.
Similar, yeah, or not too far from like every time someone who's in a movie and that movie gets played on, television on
Oh,
Sunday, they get a couple of
residuals.
cents residual. Yes. But I'm not sure it will go down this way, but it's like there's a world in which you as an artist are making art that is training material for a computer. So your compensation as an artist is as much to train a image generating algorithm as it is
Yeah,
for people, right? I'm not making this for a human to use as their book cover. I'm making this so a machine will make their book cover.
yeah, which is right. I mean, and that gets it right back into, I mean, that's prime Turker territory.
It's exactly, because it's like these technologies, I mean, they smash right into what was the task we asked folks to do? Summarize content. This smashes right into.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of those Turk jobs, one side of this is like for MTurk, it's like this is a nuclear bomb. A lot of those jobs have now been supplanted by these things. I mean, that's one way to view it.
Yeah. Yeah. Dang.
But it would be, I mean, but then is the Turk job, okay, well, I'm not writing summaries anymore, but I'm writing creative work to make a smarter algorithm.
Yeah.
I mean, my job as an artist, this is, kind of dystopian view perhaps, but it's like my job as an artist is to make art for the machine to learn what art is so it can do it.
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting implication of like, I mean, going back to sort of the notion of the sort of pedagogical implications of chat GPT is like, well, one of the implications of GPT chat or GPT-3 is we're all now pedagogues. Everybody on the internet is a teacher now of and for the internet.
And, like with my professional writing students, because that's another thing I point out with this is like, another thing this can't do really well is novelty, where I'm like, if you're a professional writer in a company, and let's say, for example, you're doing something like Ryan talks about, like, I have to write instructions for how to use this product, but it's a product we made. Therefore, I can't take an existing system and say, give me instructions for how to use this, because it doesn't know what this is, which means it needs to be trained. And that training is going to come in what form? Me writing up what it is. So it's like I'm doing professional writing, as Rick and Morty kind of say, with additional steps, where it's like I'm not writing it for a human being. These instructions aren't for the packaging. They're to train our algorithm to write the instructions that go on the package. It's got to learn about this new thing we made. I'm the one to do it,
Right.
It's weird because it's like, well, then just cut out the middleman and you just write the instructions for the packaging yourself. I don't know how it's going to shake out,
Right. Yeah, because it may end up being that it's actually not all that efficient or seamless or weird.
Yeah, I mean, we're at an hour here. That's kind of what I'm doing right now, is because this is popping up in interesting ways. I saw kind of a couple of screeds about copy editing and sort of its relationship to this, that, then does writing become a lot more shaping what the machine has said, or the task of massaging it into giving what you want it to produce, as you were doing, right? You got to figure out how to phrase your question to get the result. And so a lot of working with Chat GPT is trying to, okay, here's the parameters of my assignment. How can I coerce it into giving me this? And it's interesting. And it's one reason why I don't forbid it with my students, because it's like, what you're doing there is analyzing the assignment. It's like, you're not exactly cheating. You're cheating in the way Bart Simpson cheated, which was he got stuck in a closet, and so he memorized the planets, right? And so when he took his test, he was like, I had it memorized. It was a whole new kind of cheating. And I think Lisa was like, that's not cheating, that's learning, you know?
Yeah.
This is similar where it's like, you know, you're not cheating, you're learning the expectations of the assignment and then producing in response to it. It's like you're learning, you're not cheating by doing this.
But that's a great, I mean, but right, that notion of, I mean, for us, right, the whole genesis of our project is like, because we've already presumed what learning is.
Right.
So what's interesting about that Bart Simpson bit is he's sort of like, there are forms of learning that might be cheating and forms of cheating that might be learning.
Well, and you can see this in the, and we'll wrap up, but you can see this in the response, you know, to kind of return it to this, that it's like, well, the calculator exists, but we still teach math. So what is it that we do? And because ChatGPT is comparatively new to kind of academics, there's been a range of kind of interesting responses where it's like, oh, okay, well, then I need to stop, you know, assigning take-home essays. What I need to do is oral examination. It's like revert to medievalism.
Yeah.
And, you know, simmering underneath that is the Platonism of you don't really know it unless it's in your skin bag, right? Where it's like, I can't use the essay. I have to now orally exam you, even though we're not really set up anymore for that kind of, because then we need like, you know, a rubric for, you know, what counts as good conversation and stuff. You know, it's like, we're not prepared for this. We could do it, but it's like, we're not really prepared for this.
Yeah.
But it also, you know, it reverts to the kind of Platonism of you don't know it unless it's in your brain. You don't know math unless you can do this, not even with scrap paper, because that's a tech according to, you know, I mean, Plato's creed is against writing.
Yeah.
You don't know this unless you can do this in your head. And it's like, yeah, but that's not what math is anymore. Seemingly that's not what writing will be anymore.
Yeah. And it also, I mean, to go back to cultural techniques, right, wherein he actually, often the examples are math, right? Even if you're doing math in your head, that's because you've internalized an symbol system, right? So even that's, you're still not doing it in your head because math itself was outside first. Right? So it's like all you've done is just memorize the numbers. You're still using numbers to do it, right? Yeah. How come numbers all of a sudden count as
right? I mean, that's the fair critique immediately of Plato's Screed and the Phaedrus, where he's like, you know, writing is dumb because it can't answer you. And it's like, yes, but sir, language is also an invention. It's like, why does that get to count as part of you in ways that,
and why is being able to answer back the standard?
Yeah.
So yeah, well, I mean, that's which is partially, you know, a lot of Walter Ong's point, particularly about Plato, right? It isn't just ironic that Plato wrote down all of his dialogues about not liking writing. I mean, Ong's point is his critique of writing is only possible through literacy.
Yeah. You know, and what to do with that? I mean,
yeah, dear Lord,
is that a giant blind spot in Plato, or is he attempting to kind of make his own understandably subjective the objective, right? Where it's like, yes, I understand that my definition is contingent, but this is the one that's going to prevail.
Yeah.
Anyway. All right.
Okay.
So, I mean, in terms of how to proceed, that's a question. How to proceed, because in the previous ones, it's like, you know, well, there's data to collect and process. We don't have that process now. How to proceed. I mean, I can tell you what I'm doing right now is I'm just collecting a lot of mostly journalism stuff that are about these and related topics, you know, things, you know, auto generation programs, be they textual or image based or whatever. That's kind of what I'm doing right now.
I'm going to read, because I have them somewhere as part of this project. I'm going to go back and maybe refresh my, go back in and look at some of the cultural technique stuff, just to see if that's still got purchase, and maybe go back and look at some of that heteromation stuff.
Well, and when you're doing that, you might shoot me in just like an email of some of an entry point into the cultural technique stuff, so I'm not completely flying blind in that.
It's in, I can't remember if I added these into the, hold on, let me pull up the Mechanical Turks folder.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because we have those notes.
Under readings. Yeah, there is, if you look at there's a folder, Theory, Culture, and Society. That's a special issue on
Okay.
cultural techniques. And so I think the Winthrop Young, I think, is the introduction. Yeah, the Winthrop Young Cultural Techniques Preliminary Remarks is like the editorial entry into that special issue, and it kind of lays them out. Yeah, it doesn't have any, and then I think I've added, there's some other, and then in the larger folder, there's 3 pieces by Siegert that are his cultural techniques, because he's not in this, I think, because he's dead, is not in that special issue.
That was my question, is like, so many of these are like commentary on it, but Siegert is like sort of at least one of the principal theorists of.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
No, let's start reading and I don't know, writing some chunks. I've got some from my talk at the Society for Literature, Arts, and the Sciences. I wrote up a little thing about the chess scandal, the poker scandal, the Kasparov complaining about Deep Blue, and then sort of linked that to I don't know why I made that sound. Linked it to the Mechanical Turk stuff. So
where is that? So I'm not.
I don't know if I put that. Let me add that into the Turks folder right now. I don't know if I did that.
What makes sense here? Readings, I guess.
I'm just going to put it in the big folder, and then you can put it wherever you want.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I do occasionally kind of
Clean house.
Yeah, just sort of.
Yeah.
I see it. All right then.
Okay. Good work. We'll talk soon.
All right. See ya.